6,000 such communities in Brazil, quilombos, where Africans liberated themselves and created many nations to recreate Africa in a new cultural context, in a new spatial context. These communities resisted enslavement from the time Africans arrived in Brazil until slavery was over, like was mentioned, at the end of 1888. So Brazil is one of the longest places where Africans were held captive. In addition to that, if we're talking about the slave trade to the West, Brazil is the country that most of, not the largest portion of enslaved Africans went. 40% of all Africans that left Africa ended up in Brazil. The rest are split up between North America, the Caribbean, and other parts of South America. But 40% of the total population of Africans that survived the Middle Passage ended up in Brazil. So when we talk about the African experience, the African diaspora experience, Brazil is our focal point. And then these liberated communities become very important for us to study, particularly during Black History Month, where a lot of the talk is about enslavement and the torture that we went through and all these things, which is important to remember, but it's also important to remember resistance and development. They not only ran away, escaped, they formed communities, they built communities, which is key for any of us thinking about the African world in 2023. It's not just about resistance, it's also about development and sustained development, which is what these Quilombolas were able to do. So let's move on. Before we talk about the trade to the West, we'll first talk about the trade to the East. We already discussed the rise of Islam and the uniting of the Arabs, and then the empires that arose out of that. And hand in hand with this, we see a trade of Africans to the East. And we already talked about, I think in this course, in week one, we talked about Basra, the Basra Rebellion in southern Iraq, where enslaved Africans from East Africa took over southern Iraq for about 15 years and formed a nation that was ultimately defeated, but they took over southern Iraq for 15 years during the 9th century, so the 800s. Africans went all into these other Islamic empires as well, including the Ottoman Empire, the Sassanid Empire, and the Mughal Empire in India. And many of these Africans were able to rise to high places. You got people like the chief eunuch among the Ottoman Turks. This was a position held by a number of African men. You know, it started out in the worst possible way that a man's servitude could start out with, because often you were castrated to become a eunuch. Eunuchs were in charge of overseeing the harems of wealthy, powerful elites in this part of the world. So sex slaves. So a lot of African women, which is one of the characteristics of the trade to the East. It mostly involved African women being transported for sexual slavery. People call concubines and harems, kind of clean it up, but we talk about sex slavery. So these women were overseen by these eunuchs, these men that were captured, castrated, and then put in this position. But what these men were able to do was to levy that position into one of political power, because eunuchs also had the task of going in between powerful figures. Eunuchs, since they were so close to the harems, also these women had agency too. They were able to finagle themselves into political power, because in many cases, if they gave birth to the child of whoever was their master, it wasn't like in the States or our understanding of slavery where the child took the position of the mother. Oftentimes, the child took position of the father. So these women were able to get out of that position in some ways, and their sons were able to get political power. So the eunuchs played a key role. And in this book, The Chief Eunuch of the Ottoman Harem, From African Slave to Power Broker, is a key book to understanding this. So this is taking place in Turkey, in Syria, where they had the earthquake just now. This is where this is going on. And a lot of the descendants of these folks, not the eunuchs, of course, they didn't have descendants, but there's a large population of Afro-Turkish people. And I haven't looked this up, but I would be interested to see how the earthquake has impacted them in particular, because they're a large portion of the Turkish population. As far east as India, you got the story of this African, probably from Ethiopia or Sudan, named Malik Ambar, Chapu Malik Ambar, who rose to prominence in India. I think we talked about him, if not in this class, in previous classes. Born in Africa, captured in the slave trade going east. He's educated. He becomes a military genius, and he uses that power to become a kingmaker in this part of India. So he's never the king, but he's essentially the king. He's the power behind the throne. He's able to put different people in that position based on his own interests because he controls the military. He was one of many African generals and military figures that were pressed into service in India at this time. And he became one of the more powerful figures. So there's a good book written about him, Malik Ambar, Power and Slavery Across the Indian Ocean. And I'm going through this kind of fast because this isn't the main topic of today's session, but I wanted to show you that Africans in bondage came out of it, and a lot of times in the East, and were able to rise to these positions of power, able to liberate themselves and do different things. So Africans aren't just pieces to be moved on the chessboard, they have agency. So important to point that out. And then again, another famous story that connects with what we're talking about today is that of Yasuke, the African samurai, who was brought to Japan by the Portuguese. We're going to be one of the main players in our discussion today. A lot of popular culture has been dedicated to this man over the past couple of years. So a lot of young people, when I mention Yasuke, they know who he is. There was a Netflix cartoon done about him. But he's a historical figure. This African man, probably from either Kenya or Ethiopia or Tanzania, somewhere in East Africa, brought to Japan by the Portuguese, and then becomes a samurai. So important figures. All right. We got to start with the Portuguese today because they're the initiators of this trade. Remember going back to week one, we talked about the Moors. We talked about those Africans from Northwest Africa, along with Arabs that took over the Iberian Peninsula in 711 CE. That's Spain and Portugal. Well, once the Portuguese got free of the Moors, they wanted to explore the west coast of Africa. They wanted to hear about and see for themselves these tales that the Moors told them about the gold mines in Africa and the wealth of Africa. So the Portuguese start making their way down the coast, beginning in the mid-15th century or the mid-1400s. The first thing they do is start kidnapping people. It's one of the first activities that they engage in. They kidnap folks to ransom them back to the rulers along the coast of West Africa as a way of making their introduction. So they would kidnap somebody, teach that person Portuguese so that they could be a go-between, and then ransom them back to the royalty in that region of Africa. We're talking about Mauritania. We're talking about Senegal. This is the region that we're focusing in at the beginning, in the early 1400s. So the Portuguese are making their way down the coast. And it's at this early period also that Africans begin resisting this treatment. 1447, we had the Battle of the Ombos River in Senegal, where an African Navy, repels these Portuguese kidnappers that have been kidnapping people. But the Portuguese are making their way. They're also, starting the process of creating sugar plantations in the Mediterranean and the Northern Atlantic, and they're beginning to take Africans as servants and then enslave people into these islands for sugarcane production. So all this is going on. And it's really important to zoom out again to connect the two things that we were talking about earlier, because the Portuguese are doing this, and eventually the Spanish begin doing this, going west and into the Atlantic and ultimately to the Americas, because of the Ottomans. The Ottomans have taken over Constantinople, which used to be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, right here. And this whole region, this whole Eastern Mediterranean is now under Islamic control. And because of the Crusades and all the geopolitical and religious warfare around that, the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe don't want to go through the Muslims to get access to the trade goods coming out of India and China, the Silk Road trade and all of that. They want to figure out a way to go around the Muslims to get to India, to get to the treasures talked about by Marco Polo and other explorers in China. And then when they find out about Japan, those places, they want to figure out a way to do that. So the Portuguese say, well, we're going to figure out how to go around Africa to get into the Indian Ocean trade, which they do. So by the time we get to the early 1500s, the Portuguese have made their way into East Africa. They start disrupting the trade that has occurred in this region for hundreds of years. Remember, we talked about in session 1, the East African Swahili city-states, all the way as south as Sofala, Mozambique, all the way north to Mogadishu. These great city-states had been involved in a trade that extended all the way to China for hundreds of years. The Portuguese come in and attack those city-states to disrupt the trade so that they can take over the trade. And eventually they start making their way to India and setting up trading posts along the coast of Africa. The Spanish take a different route. 1492, the same year that the Songhai Empire changes hands. We talked about that in session 2 or session 3, from Sunni Ali to Askia Muhammad Ture. The same year that happens, the Spanish, earlier in that year, January 1st, pushed the final vestige of the Moors back into Africa. So the Spanish are completely free. Later on that year, Columbus convinces Queen Isabella to finance his trip west, because he thinks, I can make it to the Indies by going west. Instead of going down around Africa, there's probably a way to get to the Indies from the west. So he sets out and he ends up in the Caribbean, but he thinks he's in India because he's not that bright of a person. And started calling the people Indians, and this is how we get this name. So Columbus goes this way. This is going to have tremendous ramifications for Africa, because once Columbus realizes that there's gold in the region that he lands in, that there are precious treasures that could be found, he immediately begins exploiting the indigenous population. His son begins exploiting the indigenous population. The conquistadors, more arrive in the Caribbean, ultimately then in Mexico, then in South America, the Spanish, then the Portuguese come in. So all of this is happening. The Spanish and the Portuguese don't want to fight each other. They just got done, fighting the Moors. So an agreement is made between the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Pope. Because at this point in the game, in the late 1490s, the only two major powers in this region, in the Americas from Europe, are the Spanish and the Portuguese. The French, the British, the Dutch, they haven't gotten over there yet. They're going to make their way over there, and they're not going to have any regard for this agreement. But at this time, it's just the Spanish and the Portuguese. So they go to the Pope and they say, Pope, help us divide up the world. You see the arrogance. They say, okay, the Pope says, all right, here's what we'll do. We'll draw a line. The Spanish, you get everything west of the line. The Portuguese, you control everything east of the line. That way, you all won't fight each other. So they drew a line down the middle of the world. This little clip at the end of South America, that went to the Portuguese. That becomes the colony of Brazil. Everything to the west, most of South America, the rest of North America, goes to the Spanish. And like I said, the French, the English, the Dutch, they're not going to respect this. So, this doesn't last too long. And then for our conversation, everything east goes to the Portuguese. And now you can see their sphere of influence at this time in 1494. It's just along the coast. Africa is not going to be colonized in the sense that we know it until about 400 years later. That's when colonization and real, true colonization takes toll. But at this point, the Portuguese are just on the coast. They're just on the coast of West Africa, South Africa, Central and South Africa, and of course, East Africa, where they have disrupted the East African trade. So this is the world in 1494, according to the Spanish and Portuguese. What's going on in Africa at the time? Just by way of map, once this kicks off, once this is decided, the Portuguese become the main group responsible for bringing Africans out of the continent to service the Americas. It's soon realized that the indigenous population are not going to be able to meet the labor needs, the exploitative labor needs of the Spanish and Portuguese. They want the raw materials in the Americas. They want them at very little price, that way they could sell them to the rest of the world. They want to cultivate sugar. They want to exploit new crops like tobacco and the gold and silver mines in South America. So they attempt to, of course, enslave the indigenous population. It doesn't work for a number of reasons, primarily that the non-immunity to European diseases, the great dying is about to kick off. This is a dying that's going to affect people that don't even get to see Spanish and Portuguese people, because disease spreads faster than human movement. So, from 1492 to the 1800s, we lose about 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas. 90%. This is one of the greatest genocides in world history is what we're dealing with. So the enslavement, and then you have people like Bartholomew de las Casas in the island of Hispaniola, who writes this treatise that says we shouldn't enslave indigenous people. We should be trying to bring them to Christ. But since we were enslaving Africans anyway, the Portuguese started this in the 1400s, we might as well just keep it going with them and bring them over. Many of them are Muslim, many of them are non-believers. So, it's cool to enslave them. In all fairness, and he was a priest that said this. That priest before he died, would later on regret saying that too. He was right. I shouldn't have said that either. But the damage was done. I mean, it was already in the works that the Africans were going to start making up the new exploited labor in the Americas. So, 1600s, most of the enslaved Africans, again, came from this region, really the early 1500s into the early 1600s. By the time we get to the 1700s, though, that situation is going to change. From the very beginnings, Africans revolted against slavery and resisted. The first Africans to actually come were known as Ladinos in Spanish. So the Spanish relied on the Portuguese. So the Portuguese procured the enslaved labor. The Spanish bought them from the Portuguese and then put them to work on the island of Hispaniola, so what's now Haiti in the Dominican Republic. These were Ladinos. These were Africans. Actually, let me take that back. These particular Africans weren't procured by the Portuguese. They had been in Spain for some time. They could speak Spanish. That some of them may have been born in Spain. They were descendants of Africans previously enslaved by the Portuguese and the Spanish who had been operating in the Mediterranean. So these Ladinos were brought to the island of Hispaniola, and in 1503 we get reports that they're collaborating with the indigenous population and escaping enslavement. 1503, Columbus comes, 1492, 11 years later we get the first reports of Africans escaping. 1521, the first large-scale revolt breaks out. And again, it's a collaboration between Africans from what's now Senegal, these are Wolof Africans, and the Taino indigenous nation. They get together and they burn down the plantation of Diego Columbus, Columbus's son. And then they escape into the mountains and form their own Quilombo, their own Maroon community. And then, of course, you have Sebastian Limba, who forms a Quilombo in 1523 of about 200, 300 warriors. Again, Africans that have escaped from enslavement and are forming their own communities from the very beginning of European colonization of the Americas. And this is a statue in the DR of Sebastian Limba there, so you can see this hero. So again, European colonization in the Americas begins in the Caribbean, and the importation of Africans follows. And Africans start populating these islands, then populating also the mainland of South America and Central America. We talked about the Wolof. All right. Let me get into the Congo, because this is where our story in Africa is going to kick off. The Kingdom of Congo is located in what's now Congo, the part of Angola, part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And by the time they begin engaging with the Portuguese, it's 1483 is where we have first contact between the Kingdom of Congo and the Kingdom of Portugal. At this time, both of these kingdoms are relatively equal in terms of their levels of development. There is not a big gap between European development and African development. In fact, one could argue African development was Africa was slightly more developed than Europe at the time, certain parts of it. The Kingdom of Congo was a wealthy kingdom. It had been established a few centuries earlier, the coming together of a number of farming kingdoms along the Congo River on the south bank. They had unified under a particular king, and all this we know from the oral tradition. And From that unification, this kingdom grew. Immense trading networks using the river as a highway, um, very fertile farming land. You had craftsmen, you had blacksmiths, you had a lot going on. Very diverse kingdom in terms of occupation, a lot of interaction going on in Central Africa. And then the Portuguese show up in 1483. When they do, the king of the Congo, and a lot of the information I'm going to be talking about today, you can find in a very recent book that came out, 2018, The Kingdom of Congo, The Origins, Dynamics, and Cosmopolitan Culture of an African Polity. This book is the results of something called the Congo King Project. It's a project that ended in 2017, but it brought together a number of scholars from Africa, from Europe, and from America that were writing about wanting to create a work like this, reconstructing the Kingdom of Congo's history using archaeology, using written records, and using oral tradition. The website for that is still up, even though the project is over. There's a lot of good materials on it. But the main thing to come out of that project was this book, if you can get your hands on it. It has a number of articles and chapters written by, scholars such as John K. Thornton and Linda Haywood and others that talk about the Kingdom of Congo, reconstructing that history. So anyway, the Portuguese come in contact with a king by the name of Nzinga Nkubu. He's the king. He sees the Portuguese coming, like many African nations that are xenophilic, meaning we like strangers, as opposed to being xenophobic. We push strangers away. Africans see strangers coming on the boat. They say, hey, come on, let's talk. Let's see what you got. We'll show you what we got, and let's see if we can, collaborate. 1491, his father, this man's father, so we're talking about Nzinga Nkubu, enters a diplomatic relationship with the Portuguese. And part of that diplomatic relationship is him converting to Christianity, him getting baptized in Christianity. And he does. And he's given the name John the First, João the First, after the Portuguese king, because apparently you can't be a Christian with an African name, according to all these Europeans. A Christian name is a European name. So anyway, he gets baptized. And he sees the Portuguese, he sees the goods that they have, because remember, they've been traveling all the way, down from Portugal, trading with Africans in West Africa, and they're smart. They're collecting intelligence. They want to know what the people at the next stop like. So they say, well, the people at the next stop, they trade in these types of shells, or they trade in this cloth, or they trade in copper bars. They get those materials, and then they make their introduction to the next group. So the King of Congo sees these people coming and says, all right, let's trade. Let's enter this relationship. Not long after he converts to Christianity, he starts to have second thoughts, because the Portuguese also bring in their priests and other folks that travel with them. And they're telling them, okay, to be a good Christian, you got to do a couple of things. Number one, all these shrines and ancestor worship and stuff, X that. You got to know only Jesus. And Portuguese and the saints of the Catholic Church. Also, you can only have one wife. That's one of the requirements of Christianity. Well, the King of Congo can't really do that. He can't just have one wife. Not because he's just, loves polygamy and all these things. It's because they're political marriages as well. The Kingdom of Congo was not an absolute monarchy. It's not, and this is a large, very large kingdom spatially. How the king maintained connections with his vassals, with folks that were underneath him, he would marry into the ruling families of those provincial sub-kingdoms. So like many African political systems, like we talked about, the king was not absolute. So in this region, from his capital, the king would marry women that represented different regions in his kingdom. So he had a bunch of wives, a lot of children by these wives, and all of them are legitimate. There's no such thing as illegitimate children. They're all legitimate. So when the Christians say you can only have one wife, he says, I'm going to convert back to my traditional African religion. I can't do that. That's going to cause upheaval. But while all this is going on, he has given his son, Mbemba, to the Portuguese to be educated. Not only in secular matters, but of course, religious matters, because the people that run the school are the religious officials. Afonso or Mbemba Nzinga gets baptized and is given the name Afonso, Afonso the First. So he grows up in the church and he believes it wholeheartedly. He's convinced. We've talked about in this class a lot of African rulers converting to one religion or another for diplomatic reasons. This is what the father did. He wasn't really convinced about Christianity. In fact, his son Afonso, who's very literate, he can write in Portuguese, he can write in different languages. He writes about this, how his father used to tease him about his Christianity. Because the father didn't really believe. He just thought this is some silly thing that the Europeans wanted him to do, go in his water, say some stuff that he didn't know in Latin, and then that'd be the relationship. But Afonso believed. He was a true believer in Christianity, and more importantly, in Christian brotherhood. When the father dies, as was the case in many African kingdoms that we've talked about, succession becomes an issue. Large kingdom, a lot of children, many of them eligible to become the next ruler, and then regional politics playing a role. So in that struggle for who's going to be the next ruler, the Portuguese see an opportunity. And they see Afonso and they're like, Afonso, you could be the next king. And Afonso wants to be king because he wants to continue the process of Christianizing the nation. He really believes that. So he becomes king with the backing of the Portuguese. The Portuguese back him, even though he wasn't considered the top candidate for the position. But because he has Portuguese backing, Portuguese weapons and different things, he's able to usurp the throne. And when he does, he unleashes his Christianity on traditional African religious institutions. He starts destroying shrines, what the Portuguese call burning idols, all of these symbols of traditional African religion. He starts to destroy them. And once he does this, and he establishes himself on the throne, the Portuguese want their payback, and they want to engage in trade. But at this point in the game, this is 1506 when he comes into the throne, the Portuguese really only want one thing, and that's enslaved Africans. That's what they want. Now, his father had provided the Portuguese with gifts of captives. The Portuguese came to Congo at a time where the Congo kingdom was expanding. And as the kingdom was expanding and fighting wars, they would have war captives. The Portuguese are now beginning to exploit Brazil. And, of course, we've talked about it. They've already have enslaved labor in Sao Tome, in Cape Verde, and other places in the Mediterranean. So they want labor. So his father starts to give them captives as gifts. Says, hey, there's captives. We just went to war. We won. We split up the spoils. Here's some captives for you. I'll take some because the Kingdom of Congo always had captives as well that worked the king's farms and did different things. But they were treated as human beings. Yeah, you're a war captive, you're a prisoner of war, but you still have certain rights. And then on top of that, the Congo people themselves in the kingdom could never be enslaved. So the only people that could be enslaved were those folks outside of the kingdom that the king went to war with. They could be made captives, but no free Congolese person was supposed to be enslaved. But the Portuguese demand for labor only increased as they saw how rich Brazil could become. So when Afonso becomes king, the Portuguese say, we want more slaves. We want more slaves. We're not going to accept, we don't want anything else from you other than slaves. And you can only pay us in slaves. Immediately, Afonso starts to see how this is destroying his kingdom. Because the Portuguese are not only taking the captives, because in order to get captives, the king has to constantly be in war. And Afonso was a warrior king. He did go and try to expand his kingdom and conquer other people and give those captives to the Portuguese, but it still wasn't enough for them. So they started kidnapping free Congolese people. They started instigating among the noblemen in the kingdom who had now started to get a taste for the goods that were coming from the Portuguese. So remember, the kingdom is not an absolute monarchy. So you have Afonso at the top, but you have all these governors and other people below that also have power, that also want to have their own relationship with the Portuguese because they're thinking about the throne. They're thinking about, whetting their appetites for European goods and other goods that are coming in. So they're also doing things on a regional level. It would be like Afonso's the prime minister, but you have all these premiers that have their own spheres of influence that are doing different things. Or in the U.S. context, Afonso's the president. You got all these governors that are doing different things. They're called no, this is a different kingdom. But anyway, Afonso writes a letter to his brother, his spiritual brother, the King of Portugal, because remember, they're all Christians, right? That's what he was taught. We're all brothers in Christ. So he says, look, we cannot reckon how great the damage is caused by the Portuguese merchants. Since the mentioned merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, and the sons of our noblemen and vassals and our relatives, because the thieves and men of bad conscience grab them, wishing to have the things and wares of this kingdom, which they are ambitious of. They grab them and get them to be sold. So great, sir, is the corruption and licentiousness that our country is being completely depopulated. And your highness should not agree with this, nor accept it as in your service. And to avoid it, we need from your kingdom no more than some priest and a few people to teach in schools, and no other goods except wine and flour for the holy sacrament. That is why we beg of you, your highness, to help and assist us in this matter, commanding your factors that they should not send here either merchants or wares, because it is our will that in these kingdoms there should not be any trade of slaves nor outlet for them. This is what he's asking for the king. He said, all we need is the stuff for communion. Don't send any goods here. Don't send any merchants here. It's destroying, it's depopulating my country. And he's very clear. They're not just taking captives. They're taking free people who I'm responsible for. I'm their king. They look to me as the protector. And how am I going to propagate the religion of Christ, the message of Christ, if I don't have people to do so? And the people don't believe in me because they fear for their lives. So this is what he asked. Of course, the king of Portugal doesn't agree. And he talks about what happens to people when they're captured. As soon as they're taken by white men, they're immediately ironed and branded with fire. And when they are carried to be embarked, if they are caught by our guards, men, the whites allege that they have bought them, but they cannot say from whom. So it is our duty to do justice and to restore to the free men their freedom, but it cannot be done if your subjects feel offended as they claim to be, because of course the whites are complaining back to the king of Portugal that the king of Congo is not allowing them to engage in trade. So all of this is going on. Afonso further writes, and this is in the book I always point you all to, Intellectual Traditions of Pre-Colonial Africa. He says, in our kingdoms, there is another great inconvenience, which is of little service to God. And this is that many of our people, keenly desirous as they are of the water and things of your kingdom. This is what I just read to you. But this is another translation of it. Afonso is writing these letters, trying to end it. The Portuguese pay it no mind. About 100 years later, and this is according to Linda Hayward, one of the great scholars of the Kingdom of Congo. A 1619 letter written by a Spanish clergyman named Bras Correa provides some insight into the important place of slaves at foreign exchange in Congo's economy. Correa noted that although shells and cloth served as the money in the Congo, Portuguese traders attempted to reduce all types of money to slaves who were embarked for Brazil. Indeed, by the opening decades of the 17th century, as demand for slaves in the Portuguese Brazil and the Spanish Indies exploded, foreign captives were not sufficient to meet the demands, and Congo elites increasingly looked to freeborn Congos to cover their foreign imports and meet their international obligations. So the Portuguese are saying, you can't give us anything but slaves. That's all we want. That's the only currency we're going to accept. That's it. It's just like in Canada, they're not going to accept Japanese money. You got to get some Canadian money if you want to do business in Canada, if you want to do business with Canadians. So back then, the Portuguese are saying, we don't want any shells, we don't want any cloth, we don't want anything that you consider currency. We don't even want gold or copper. We want captives. So if you want what we got, and many of these noblemen had gotten, again, used to European goods and these things, if you want what we got, you got to give us captives. And if you can't get us captives, we'll get them from somebody else, which make you a captive if we arm your neighbor to come get you. So all of this was causing intense amounts of insecurity in Africa. But it extended further south. So right now we've been talking about the Kingdom of Congo. The Kingdom of Ndongo was next in line for the Portuguese. Because again, the need for captives kept growing because of Brazil. So they said, well, we're going to also build a relationship with the king of the kingdom to the south in Dongo and have the same type of process. Very similar kingdoms, very similar political setups. A king, and then you have these provincial leaders. So it's very similar to what was going on in Congo. And prior to the Portuguese coming, a lot of relationship between Congo and Ndongo. Queen Njinga, we talked about her in our Shiro's class, and we talked about the book written about her by Linda Haywood, professor at Boston University. But I won't get into it because just for the sake of time, we're about to go to our first break. But because of the wars initiated by this, folks fighting, you have natural nation building that's happening all over the world, but at the same time, you have these local rulers that are either trying to not get involved in the slave trade themselves, or those that are actively involved by trying to conquer either their neighbors or the civil wars that are happening in these populations. All of that is contributing to insecurity, and it's contributing to this mass forced migration of Africans to Brazil and to the Caribbean during this time period, 1600s and the 1700s. Now, what happens when they get there? When these Africans who have come out of this region that has been violent, they're coming out of wars, they're coming out of civil wars, they know how to fight, they've been captured, they're captives, but they're coming out of situations where fighting has occurred. So when they get to the Americas, they just keep fighting. Yeah.
Is that 700?
Yes. And just in this time period. And that's just the people that win. That's not the people that survived. Because oftentimes when the numbers of enslavement are brought up, people only talk about the people that survived. But throughout this whole process, it's a process of death. Because all these people weren't right at the coast. So you had to capture somebody, then transport them to the coast, which could be anywhere from hundreds, if not thousands of miles to the coast on foot. Many people died in that. Then, as soon as you got to the coast, you weren't immediately put on a ship. There were these dungeons where people were put in the most horrendous conditions. Oftentimes, there'd be churches on top of these dungeons, like in the case in Ghana. Many people died in that. Then, of course, on the ships, a third of the people on the ships died. So you got all of this death before people even make it to the Americas. Once they get to the Americas, they keep fighting. And fighting occurs, resistance occurs on all these stops as well. There's resistance on the marches. There's resistance at the slave dungeons. There's resistance on the ships. And then, of course, when they get to the Americas, they continue to fight. If you're a descendant of these people, you got some strong ancestors. These people fought every step of the way, and it's always important to point that out. Angola Janga, Little Angola. This is the largest quilombo that we know of, an independent African nation in Brazil that existed in the 1600s, during the time of Nzinga, during the time of the Kingdom of Congo. Africans that were brought to Brazil as a result of these civil wars and other wars, these captives, they keep fighting when they get to Brazil. They escape, whether it's the plantations, whether it's the mines, because Brazil, there was a lot of mining going on, gold mining, silver mining. They escape, they go and they form these quilombos. Quilombo is actually a Central African term meaning war camp. So they would form these communities, and Angola Janga was the largest. It was set up politically as a mirror of what was going on in Africa. You had a paramount king, Ganga Zumba was the first that we know of, and then his nephew Zumbi. And even the succession follows African rules. It was a nephew that succeeded his uncle. And we saw what we've been seeing in this class. Matrilineal succession has been the way of, thing you had to be related to the king through the royal family, so through your mother. The name Angola Janga, Little Angola, because the king in Ndongo was known as the Angola. The Angola, that's the name of the king. And that ultimately becomes the name of the place, Angola. So Little Angola, Angola Janga is what the name that these Africans gave to their settlement. The Portuguese called it the Republic of Palmeiras, because when they went to war with it, they couldn't defeat it until 1695. and this is just these dates or just the date of its last leader, Zumbi, but the beginnings of this Quilombo go back to about 1605. So it lasted about 90 years, almost 100 years. The Portuguese called it the Republic of Palmares because they recognized that, okay, this isn't a strictly hierarchical kingdom where the king calls all the shots. There's these checks and balances. So in the Portuguese mind, they saw it as a republic. But really, it's a confederation. It's on the same level of what we were seeing going on in the Kingdom of Ndongo or in the Kingdom of Congo, where you had a paramount king, but you also had these sub-rulers of these different villages in it. This is in northeast Brazil. This is where a lot of the Quilombolas that are presently fighting to maintain their land and to get counted on the census, these are the descendants of these folks. Not this particular Quilombo, but other Quilombos that would arise in Brazil throughout its history of enslavement, going from the early 1500s all the way till 1888. So you have this. They have a religious system very similar to what was going on in Africa. Because again, these are Africans that are fighting. Fight, get free. They want to set up what they had back home or something very similar, but they made alterations. They had a Christian church because, again, many of them had been Christian because of what was going on for about 200 years in the region. They had African religions. They had indigenous people and some poor whites that they interacted with. This wasn't just an all-African place. They even incorporated indigenous spirituality into their religions. We see evidence of this not just in Brazil, but also in Suriname. We see the same type of religious mixing between indigenous spirituality and African spirituality. So you have all of this going on. Very important place for you to have in your mental Rolodex. Always remember Ngola Janga. Again, the last leader for whose martyrdom is marked at November 20th, which is Black Consciousness Day in Brazil, is Zumbi of the Palmares. And you'll see statues and monuments to Zumbi all over Brazil. We'll stop there for a second and open up to any questions or comments that folks might have about what we've talked about so far before we get into other groups like the Garifuna, and then we'll also talk about Jamaica today as well before we close out. Any questions? Daniel, anything in the chat or any hands up?
Yes, there's a question. Somebody said, disease killed off most of the population in the new American continents. Was such a population reduction due to disease recorded on the African continent? If not, are there any reasons recorded for the Africans' enhanced immunity resistance?
It's because of, so we're talking about smallpox, we're talking about diseases like that. Africans had resistance because Africans had sustained contact with Europeans for centuries. So those diseases had gone through those ancient communities. The indigenous Americans had been so isolated for so long that when these diseases mutated in the East, in Africa and Europe and in Asia, just like with the coronavirus, these things mutate and all this. But once you have disease, it goes to your population. People that survive build up immunities, build up ways to fight it, and that stuff spreads throughout the populations. That wasn't happening with the Americans because they've been so isolated from everybody else for so long. So that's why Africans were able to sustain themselves against these diseases in a way that the indigenous population weren't. But we can't blame it completely on just the disease by themselves. It was a major factor, but the diseases were also biological weapons used by the Europeans. We've all heard of that history of putting blankets with disease on them and giving them to indigenous people. That particularly happened in North America. And then in addition to that, you have the fighting, the conquering of Mexico by Cortez, the conquering of the Aztecs by Cortez, the conquering of the Inca by Pizarro, and those fights that happened in Peru and those places. So it's not just the disease, it's also the religious motivated conquering, religious and economic motivated conquering of the indigenous populations. Because all this stuff was done in the name of Christ. All the conquistadors were doing this in the name of Christ. So that's key. Other questions? Any hands up, Daniel? Any questions in the chat? It doesn't appear to be. I see. Is that a 2? Or is that just like a thank you or something, Daniel?
That's the comment. Somebody said a friend told me that Netflix is starting a series on African queens. The first one featured will be Queen Zinga. It's supposed to start during February for Black History Month.
Huh, interesting. I didn't know about that. That's I would have to check those out, see how good they are. Cool. All right. Let me talk about a few things and then we'll wrap it up. Another group of, and what we're talking about again, Angola, Jonga, these are independent African communities in the Americas. When we talk about enslavement, when we talk about the African experience, we can't leave these things out because there were Africans that were able to establish themselves and develop and sustain outside of the system of enslavement. The Garifuna are a perfect example. These are Africans picked up somewhere in West Africa, and 1635, they're shipwrecks near St. Vincent, and they establish a relationship with the indigenous population there, the Caribs, and they form this community. So they're never actually enslaved. They cause the shipwrecks, and then they form this community. They start fighting with the British by the time we get to the 1700s, and then they're eventually exiled to Honduras and Belize, and I think there's another nation there. I think a little bit of Costa Rica, and that's where many of their population. A lot of them are in actually New York. Actually, a lot of Garifuna have migrated to New York, but this was a group that formed this culture, part indigenous, part African, never conquered, fought against Europeans to maintain their sovereignty. So a lot of information to be learned from them. They have a language that is as an African base, but it also has indigenous loan words. It's a very interesting group. But I want to go actually into Jamaica and talk about the Maroons there. Maroon is just the Spanish word for the Quilombos. Actually, I'll give you another one before we go to Jamaica, which is actually Mexico. The Free Township of San Lorenzo de Negros, 1630. This was established by Yanga. Yanga was a Central African enslaved by the Portuguese, ends up in the Spanish colony of Mexico, leads a Quilombo liberation movement, and his tactics were so good that he was able to negotiate a peace treaty that allowed him to establish the Free Township of San Lorenzo. So he wins, and this township continued to be free, up until today. I mean, it's still there, and this is part of the Afro-Mexican heritage. Not all Afro-Mexicans were free, because not all Afro-Mexicans can make it to the township of San Lorenzo, but there's a large population of Afro-Mexicans. And just like the Quilombolas in Brazil, they had to fight to get on the census. So we're just getting the numbers now about how many Africans are in Mexico. And it's very similar to the situation actually in Canada. The fight for disaggregated data is key to talk for the human rights of Black folks, both in Canada and in Mexico. It's about the same numbers, I think. I think there's just about as many Africans in Mexico as there are in Canada. Might be a little bit more, actually, because I think Mexico's population is a lot more than Canada's. I gotta double check that, but the population is very similar in terms of demographics to what's going on in Canada. So, a lot of people are surprised, like, oh, there's Black people in Canada. People don't say that too much anymore, but people say, oh, there's Black people in Canada. Some people are surprised, there's Black people in Mexico. Yeah, they've been there for a long time, just like Black people in Canada have been there for a long time. So very analogous situations. But the Free Township of San Lorenzo. Just a little bit about Yanga. Yanga was a Negro with a gentle body of royal blood, and whom people said would have been king had he not been captured. With such elevated thoughts, he had been the first in the rebellion for 30 years. His authority and his lovely manners toward those of his color were greatly wooed his people. He was very old, having reserved himself for the administration of civil and political affairs. He trusted the direction of troops to another Black from Angola, whose name was Francisco de la Matosa, the name of the owner he served. So again, you had an African, Yanga was probably from Guinea or somewhere like that, and he entrusted his troops to an African from Angola. And again, this is 1630. So he is coming to Mexico as a result of those civil wars that are happening in Angola during Nzinga's time, right before Nzinga's time, and others. So you see the role played by Africans from Angola. We're going to move to further west, and we're going to talk about the makings of the Ashanti Confederacy and how this impacted Africans in the Caribbean. Because many Africans from this region of West Africa end up in slavery. So this is modern day Ghana, part of Togo. So this is an image of the current Ohima, the Queen Mother of the Ashanti Confederacy. This is the current one. So you see her here, her retinue being carried and all the gold around her. So this was a very important position in the Ashanti Confederacy. And we've talked about this position in times before, so I won't go too in depth with it. But the Queen Mother of the Ashanti is probably the second most powerful person after the Asante Hene in the kingdom. And in some instances, might be even more powerful than the Asante Hene, depending on the personality of who's in the seat. The Queen Mother may nominate a candidate from among the members of the Stool family in consultation with the Gyasi Hene, or the head of the palace administration, and her relatives. But the nomination of a candidate remains her sole responsibility. The Queen Mother had the responsibility of choosing the next Asante Hene, the next head of the Asante Confederacy. Very powerful position. She had her own troops. She had her own land. A very powerful, one of the most powerful women in West Africa. Same time that we're talking about these events in Central Africa, 1600s and 1700s, the Ashanti Grand Confederacy is arising somewhere around 1670. Under the leadership of Osei Tutu, the Ashanti are able to overthrow the tyrannical Dinshara kingdom. Now it's tyrannical from their oral tradition. Now we don't know from the Dinshara perspective whether they would consider tyrannical, but this is what oral history does. We talked about this, how people remember. So the Dinshara kingdom's overthrown, and Osei Tutu is the head of this confederacy that overthrows it. And he's given the title, the Asante Hene, the head of the Asante Confederacy, and he sits on a golden stool. The golden stool supposedly came down from heaven not long after his victory, and that becomes the symbol of this confederation. This becomes very important later on in our class. Either in this class or we'll talk about it in early history of the African Renaissance, because the British are going to want this symbol of this kingdom. But that's a conversation for later on. But the stool itself, this throne, is a key symbol of all of the groups in this confederation. Because it's set up very much like the Kingdom of Ndongo or the Kingdom of Congo. You have a head king who is basically the king of the kings, because there's other sub-rulers that all pay tribute and allegiance to this king. But his voice isn't absolute. Those people have power and control over their regions. As long as they pay their taxes, as long as they pay their tribute and that thing, they have tremendous amounts of control in their own region. So that's key. But as this confederation is growing and conquering and becoming more of an empire, all of these wars are happening. And guess who's at the coast to benefit from all these wars? Our good friends, the Portuguese, who set up Elmina and some of these other slave castles and dungeons that would later be taken over by the Dutch, and even the Danish are operating in Ghana, and then ultimately the British. But our first are our good friends, the Portuguese. So they're there benefiting from all of this warfare that comes with the establishment of this empire. Captives are being sold to the Portuguese. The Portuguese are then taking them to the Americas and selling them to the Spanish and to other folks that are growing colonies in the Americas in the 1600s, which now we got Britain and we got France in the mix, and we have the Dutch in the mix as well. And that British desire for labor is going to grow, particularly in 1695, once the British wrest control of Jamaica from the Spanish. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the world at this time as well, because you also have in the 1600s in Europe horrible amounts of European tribalism, tribal wars among the Europeans. The only difference is, like I mentioned in this class numerous times, there aren't Africans in Europe wanting to take the captives. That was the difference. Europe had all these tribal wars to develop. In the 1600s, because of the Protestant Reformation, you had all these different kingdoms fighting religious and tribal wars in Europe. You had the Dutch fighting the Portuguese. The German states aren't united at this time. The Holy Roman Empire is trying to hold on. You got the on the sea. All this stuff is also affecting things going on at sea because the British are fighting the Spanish in a kind of a proxy war among all of this, and the British are financing pirates to attack Spanish ships. So this is all tribalism. They call what's going on in Africa tribalism. We can call what's going on in Europe tribalism. And these are very brutal wars. Somewhere in the 1600s, during the 30 Years' War, somewhere between 5 and 8 million Europeans died in this conflict. They're fighting amongst each other, primarily over religion. The Catholics are fighting the Protestants and all that. So all of that's happening, and it's impacting things that are happening in the Americas as well. So 1695, the British take Jamaica from the Spanish. The Africans that are enslaved in this region, many of the same dynamics that we've been talking about, civil wars, inter-ethnic conflict, they all pass the city of Coromantee on their way to the ships. So Africans from this region are given the name Coromantee Negroes by the Spanish, by the British, who are keeping records of all of these transactions. Coromantee Negroes. And the other reason why we know about the presence of so many Coromantee Negroes in these various colonies at this time, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, is because of their names. In this region of the world, in this Akan cultural context, people have day names. So there's 7 names for men, there's 7 names for women. Names like Kwamina, Kwame, Afua, Kuba, Kofi, Kwesi, Yao, all of these names. And we see these names in bastardized versions show up in English records and Spanish records, Kwaku, and the like. So whenever there's a rebellion, whenever something happens and these names are mentioned, we know that they are from this region and were referred to as Coromantee Negroes. When these Africans make their way to the Caribbean and make their way to North America, again, they're coming out of a context of war, civil wars. They continue to fight. And they lead some of the more famous rebellions in the history of enslavement in the Americas, as well as set up some of the most long-lasting Quilombo communities that the Spanish refer to as maroon communities, from the Spanish word cimarron, which means a runaway or breakaway cattle, really refers like an animal that's run away. But then that gets shortened by the British to just maroon communities. All right, so we're going to look at a few examples of these Africans attempting to recreate African political and spiritual systems in the Americas. So we'll start with Barbados, which was one of the original hells on earth when it comes to enslavement. Haiti's going to take that crown a little bit later, but Barbados was really hell on earth, and the Africans understood that. I just mentioned a few of these rebellions. In Jamaica, when it was Spanish Jamaica, you had Africans from this part of Africa who rebelled, led by Juan Lobolo and Juan de Serra in the 1660s and 1670s. You had the first Maroon War, which we'll talk about. You had a Coromantee Rebellion in 1741 in New York City, where Africans from this region attempted to burn down New York City. You had Tacky's Rebellion in Jamaica in 1760, Amina's Rebellion in Berbice, modern-day Guyana, the Second Maroon War in 1795, and then Kwamina's Rebellion in Guyana. Different Kwamina, but in the same place some 60 years later. In Barbados, 1675, you have this plan for a large-scale rebellion. And we've talked about this in previous classes. It's called King Cuffy's Rebellion. Barbados was an island where you had 37,000 Africans to about 17,000 whites. What they did to Africans of Barbados, they would do to Africans in Haiti. They wanted to work them to death. They weren't interested in Africans reproducing. They wanted to just work you to death, get more Africans. It was a sugar economy. This is what they wanted to do. Petty maroonage was common, which was common throughout the Americas. People would escape and then come back to slavery. Like they would just say, I'm taking a vacation from slavery and escape. But then they would come back because they had familiar ties and these types of things. That was common throughout the Americas. But in this case, these Africans, and many of them Coromantee Negroes, so they had the same cultural context. They understood the same political systems. They spoke the same languages or very similar languages. They plot for almost 2 years about how to overthrow the whites on Barbados, take over the island, and liberate themselves. That was the plan. And the plan was they were going to name their leader Kofi. They were going to install him as king. Again, installment. They were going to take what they knew about politics, what they understood about how you create a political system from what's now Ghana, and transport it into Barbados by creating a king that would be sat on a stool as a symbol of power, symbol of kingship. Of course, they were going to slit all the masters' throats. They were going to burn the cane fields, and this is what they were going to do. But it got somebody ratted. Somebody snitched. One of the young men that was involved in the plot, or was told about the plot by another young man, he went to the guy that told him about the plot, and he was like, I don't know if I could do it. I don't know if I could kill anybody. I really don't feel comfortable with this. And the guy was trying to fortify him and tell him, this is how we're going to get free. So if you're down, this is what we got to do. Well, while they're having this conversation, it's overheard by this woman named Anna, a.k.a. Anna Fortuna. And we don't know if she got that name Fortuna because it was fortunate that she overheard this conversation, or if that was actually her name. But anyway, she was enslaved to this judge named Giles Hall, and she goes and tells the judge what she overhears. They go find the young man. The young man confesses to it, and it blows up the entire thing. So martial law was declared. 100 suspects were questioned. 42 enslaved Africans were found guilty, 6 of whom were burned alive. 11 were beheaded. The bodies of the later were dragged through the streets, and they found out through the investigation that there were also some poor whites involved in this plot as well. So they made sure to separate poor whites from Africans more, and increase the patrols and different things in Barbados. But had this snitch not snitched, and this plan actually would have went through, again, 2 years of planning. There were oaths involved. There were different things involved. Barbados would have been what Haiti becomes in the 19th century, this island of liberated Africans. And the poor whites that were involved as well. I don't know if any poor whites were burned, but definitely they made it so that Africans and poor whites weren't interacting as much anymore. So very important, but one that did succeed, Nanny of the Maroons. During that time period that the Spanish and the British were fighting over Jamaica, many Africans liberated themselves in the context of those wars and set up these communities where, again, they recreated what was in the cultural context in West Africa. The leader of one of the more famous Maroon communities, Nanny, which was odd to the Europeans that they would have this old woman who was in charge. Why would they follow an old woman? That didn't make sense to the British. But then when you realize that they're coming out of a cultural context where the Queen Mother is one of the most powerful figures in the nation, it only makes sense that that's what they would recreate. And again, many of these Africans were coming from the Coromantee region. Again, this is the current Queen Mother. Just want to show you that Nanny's position as leader of the Maroons, who fought against the British, used guerrilla tactics and spiritual warfare and other things to ultimately get a peace treaty that was signed with the British to keep their liberated space. And again, in Jamaica today, there's still descendants of Maroon communities that existed from this time period that formed political systems, religious systems different than the Africans that were still enslaved. That Coromantee resistance would continue. Tacky's rebellion in Kingston. So this is a more urban rebellion. Coromantees, again, 1760. They began their revolt on Easter Sunday. Many of the revolts of enslaved people happened on Sundays, Christmas, and Easter, because they knew the Europeans would be vulnerable, because they'd be partying, they'd be in a festive mood, and this is when the rebellions would happen. It covered several parishes. They killed 60 whites, and it was organized by influential Obeah men and women. So these are spiritual practitioners that used the religious systems of Africa to fight for liberation. One of these people was Akua, called Kuba, who was elected queen by the Africans in Kingston. So again, they're not just living as enslaved people. They're forming their own political system. Even before they get liberation, they know we're going to need leaders. And we recognize these people as leaders, and we're going to try to recreate what we had back home. So if you have a king, you have to have a queen mother. So they elected this queen, this woman, and she led the rebellion. She had, one of the reports said, at the meeting, she had sat in state under a canopy with a sort of robe on her shoulders and a crown upon her head. Very similar to this. Again, you see the canopy, you see how the Queen Mother is sitting. They're just recreating what they had back home. And the plan was they were going to take over. She was going to be queen, Taki was going to be king, and that's how it was going to be. And again, they're not in a relationship, they're not married, just like the Queen Mother wasn't always the mother of the king or the wife of the king. This is the political system. Ultimately, however, this rebellion was put down, but Akua's story doesn't end because she's exiled to Cuba, but somehow she convinces the captains to turn the ship around that's taking her from Jamaica to Cuba, and she ends up fighting on the other side of the island before she's finally captured and executed. But you see these examples. I'll go to one more, then we'll stop for the day. In Berbice, modern-day Guyana, another rebellion that was successful for a time, had a few things changed, few decisions made, one way or the other. Could have been a completely different history. This could have been Haiti again before Haiti. This was 1673. Africans, many of whom Coromantee Negroes, names like Kofi, names like Kwamina, and others, take over this colony. A well-planned, well-executed revolt. Women played a key role. Among the Akan, female counselors served as social critics who helped regulate people's behavior. No doubt drawing on such customs, Amelia van Hollanda and Zelandia, Kofi's sister from the Middle Passage, was said to have counseled him about people's loyalty. The rulers that took over, led by Kofi, that took over this part of Guyana and kicked out the whites. The whites were at their end of rule in Berbice. But the problem was Kofi didn't listen to a lot of his counselors. Even though he was king, he still had counselors, but he didn't listen to a lot of his counselors. Kofi engaged in correspondence and negotiation with the whites and their governor who were on the run. They basically were pushed to the coast and were basically on this ship, and most of them were ready to leave and abandon the colony after the Africans had taken over. But the governor convinced them to stay and let's negotiate with the Africans, and Kofi actually negotiated with this governor. So there's a lot of back and forth with letters, but really what the governor was doing was stalling for time so that he can get reinforcements to come and save him, which is actually what happened. So had the Africans not negotiated with these Europeans and wiped them out when they had the chance, or kicked them out of Berbice when they had a chance, the situation would have been a lot different. But these whites stalled for time and were able to get support. But the important thing is when they had control over the region, again, they set it up very similar to what was going on in Africa. And these women held tremendous power. And some of the whites that couldn't get away were actually enslaved by the blacks. And they would whip them and carry out all types of stuff that the whites were doing to them. So that was key. But we'll stop there for the day, and we'll go back to the continent next week. We'll probably talk about South Africa. But it's important to talk about these African communities in the Americas, how they're connected to what was going on in the continent, how they're influenced by global movements of European tribalism and European movement, and how all this stuff interconnects. Because this month, again, I always go back to, we're in Black History Month. You're going to hear a lot of isolated stories, but it's important to realize how they all connect. It's important to talk about resistance, and it's important to talk about development. Because in 2023, we still have to do a lot of that. Still a lot more resistance to be done, and there's still a lot more sustainable development to be, actualized by African people around the world. And these historical examples show us what to do and what not to do when it comes to nation building and how to sustain. So we'll stop there for today. Open it up to any final questions or comments or discussions or announcements about any events going on or anything like that. Daniel, anything in the chat, or are there any hands up?
Somebody in the chat asked, could you please reshare the name of the book you referred to us earlier?
Which one? So there was a few. One is Intellectual